In every city, there are streets the streetlights forget. Places where the fog doesn't lift, it settles. Into the bones. Into the records. Into cases no one wants reopened. They told her it would be simple. Walk in. Walk out. Don't look back. But nothing in this world stays buried. And everyone looks back, eventually. Some crimes don't end when the sirens fade. They send out waves. Through testimony. Through memory. Through the people who survive them. They reverberate.
Help me.
This is one of those cases. This is reverberating noir.
Lancaster, Pennsylvania. December 1763. The winter is bitter, the kind of cold that gets into the walls of a building and stays there. Inside a stone workhouse on the edge of town, 6 people huddle together. An old man, his wife, a teenage boy, a young woman, and 2 others. They are the last survivors of an entire community, a people who had farmed this land, traded with their neighbours, and placed every ounce of their trust in a government that promised them that those stone walls would keep them safe. Outside, the sound of horses. More than 100 of them. And then the door comes down.
What happened in that workhouse on December the 27th, 1763 was not a skirmish. It was not a clash of cultures or a tragedy of misunderstanding. It was a massacre, carried out in a settled town, against people in government custody, by a mob that every single person in the colony knew by name, and not one of them was ever convicted.
I'm Adam Jones.
And I'm Nina Jovovich.
And this is Case File Unsolved. Today, we're going back more than 2.5 centuries to a story that doesn't get told nearly enough, the story of the Paxton Boys, the Conestoga people, and one of the most complete institutional failures in the history of American law.
Before we get into the events themselves, Adam, I think we need to set the scene, because context here is everything.
Absolutely. By 1763, the Conestoga, also known historically as the Susquehannock, were a remnant people. They were not a powerful nation. They were not a military threat. There were roughly 20 men, women, and children living in a small settlement near what is now Millersville, Pennsylvania. They farmed, they hunted, they made brooms and baskets and sold them to their white neighbours. They had maintained peaceful relations with Pennsylvania's colonial government for generations.
And that relationship was formalized. This wasn't just a casual arrangement. The province of Pennsylvania had an explicit, long-standing policy of friendship and protection toward the Conestoga. Benjamin Franklin, who would later become one of the most vocal critics of what happened, described them plainly. He said they were, quote, protected by the government, and had a small allowance from the state to assist them in maintaining themselves. These were wards of the colonial state. They had done everything right.
And yet, 1763 was also the year of Pontiac's War, a broad Native American uprising against British expansion across the frontier, and the Pennsylvania backcountry was burning. Settlers had been killed. Farms had been destroyed. Families had been taken captive. The trauma was real, Nina. I want to be clear about that. The fear in those frontier communities was not invented.
No, it wasn't. But here's where the psychology becomes critical. Fear, when it's left to fester without leadership or accountability, doesn't stay rational. It metastasizes. And in the Scots-Irish Presbyterian settlements around the frontier town of Paxton or Paxtang, that fear had made a catastrophic moral leap. From some Native Americans are attacking us to all Native Americans are our enemies. That distinction, that collapse of distinction, is what made the Conestoga a target. Not anything they had done, but simply what they were.
And into that atmosphere stepped men like Matthew Smith and Lazarus Stewart, leaders, organizers, demagogues who gave the community's rage a direction and a target. They called themselves the Paxton Boys. The morning of December the 14th, 1763, more than 50 armed men ride out of Paxton before dawn. They move fast and they move quiet. They reach Conestoga town, the small Conestoga settlement, just as the morning is breaking. Most of the community is still asleep. The elderly, the children, the Paxton Boys don't announce themselves, they don't issue demands, they attack.
6 people are killed in that first assault. The cabins are burned to the ground, everything the Conestoga owned destroyed. But 6 people had been away from the village that morning. Trading, visiting, neighbors, they came back to ash and bodies. A local man gathered those 6 survivors and brought them to the Lancaster Workhouse, a sturdy stone building, the most secure location available. The magistrates of Lancaster County placed them there for their own protection.
Governor John Penn in Philadelphia was furious. He issued proclamations condemning what he called the, quote, atrocious and cruel murder. He ordered magistrates to use all lawful means to apprehend the perpetrators. But his authority on the frontier was fragile, and his proclamations were just words on paper.
13 days. That's how long those 6 survivors had. 13 days inside those stone walls, believing they were safe.
December the 27th, 1763. The Paxton Boys come back. This time, there are more than 100 of them. They ride into Lancaster in broad daylight, through a settled, civilized town, past houses and shops and people who watch them pass. They go straight to the workhouse.
Think about what that means for a moment. This isn't a raid on a remote frontier settlement. This is a mob of over 100 armed men marching through a colonial town to attack a government building. In the middle of the day. In plain sight of everyone.
They break down the door, inside old Shehays and his wife, a young woman named Betty, a teenager, a child, and one other, the last of the Conestoga. They had nowhere to run, no weapons, no escape. The Paxton Boys entered and killed every single one of them, with tomahawks, knives, guns. When it was over, the Conestoga people were gone, an entire community, wiped from existence. On the floor of a building they had been told would keep them safe.
The colonial authorities in Philadelphia reacted with what I can only describe as genuine horror. Governor Penn and the provincial council launched an investigation immediately. Warrants were issued. The massacre became the central topic of political debate in the entire colony.
And yet, not one person was ever convicted.
And this is where the story becomes more than just a historical atrocity, Adam. Because what happened next is a masterclass in how impunity works. It wasn't one failure. It was a cascade of failures, each one making the next more inevitable.
Walk us through it.
First, the Wall of Silence. On the frontier, the Paxton Boys were not universally despised. To a significant portion of the backcountry population, they were heroes. Men who had done what the government was too timid to do. Witnesses who could have identified the killers were either sympathetic to the cause or terrified of retaliation. The names of the leaders circulated freely in pamphlets and correspondence. Smith, Stewart, others. Everyone knew. No one who could testify was willing to.
And then there was the grand jury.
The Lancaster County Grand Jury, January 1764. They were tasked with investigating both massacres. And here is the detail that I find most revealing of everything. They issued some indictments for the first massacre at Conestoga town. But for the Workhouse massacre, the one committed in a settled town against people in government custody by a mob of over 100 men in broad daylight, nothing. No indictments, no charges. No accountability. The legal door closed. And it never opened again.
And then the Paxton Boys made their next move. They announced their intention to march on Philadelphia itself, to present their grievances to the government, and in all likelihood to kill the Native Americans who had been sheltered there for safety.
And at that point, something critical shifts. The government stops thinking like a prosecutor and starts thinking like a negotiator. Benjamin Franklin himself rode out to Germantown to meet the mob. He helped persuade them to disperse. And yes, in the immediate term that prevented more bloodshed. But the implicit message of that negotiation was devastating. The Paxton Boys were now a political constituency to be managed, not a criminal enterprise to be dismantled. Their grievances were heard. Their crimes were condemned in language and ignored in practice.
Pacification over justice.
Before we go further, if this kind of deep dive storytelling is what you come here for, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We do this every week. New cases, forgotten histories, and the stories that the textbooks glossed over. It genuinely helps us keep going. Now back to Lancaster.
Here is the thing that I keep coming back to, Nina. The Conestoga did everything right. By every standard a government could set, they had earned protection. They maintained peace through every provocation. They cooperated with colonial authorities. They placed their trust in explicit, formal assurances of safety. And they were annihilated.
And the mechanism of that annihilation wasn't just the mob. It was the grand jury that refused to indict. The witnesses who stayed silent. The government that chose negotiation over prosecution when the political cost of real accountability became too high. Each of those was a choice, not a failure of circumstance. A choice.
And the sum of those choices is a society that had decided, however, implicitly that some lives simply did not require justice.
That pattern didn't end in 1763. That's what makes this story so uncomfortable to sit with. The dynamic of a vulnerable community placed in nominal government protection only to be abandoned when the political cost of real protection becomes too high. That dynamic has a long shadow in American history. And the first step toward understanding how it keeps happening is refusing to look away from what it actually was.
The Paxton Boys were never convicted. The leaders, Smith, Stewart, the others, lived out their lives as free men, in some quarters as celebrated ones. The Conestoga ceased to exist as a people on the floor of a Lancaster workhouse. What we owe them now, at this distance, is at minimum the refusal to soften it. Not frontier conflict, not a tragic episode in colonial history. A mob broke down a door and murdered 6 people who had been promised safety by their government. And no one was punished for it. The stone walls of that workhouse still stand in Lancaster, and the silence inside them has never really ended.
When a legal system functions perfectly well until it's asked to hold powerful, popular men accountable for killing people the community has already decided don't fully matter, that's not a broken system. That's the system working exactly as it was designed to, and that is the most disturbing truth of all.
Thank you for listening to Case File Unsolved. If this episode stayed with you, if it made you think, or feel, or want to know more, please subscribe. Leave us a comment. Tell us what you want us to dig into next. These stories deserve to be told. And your support is what makes that possible.
We'll see you in the next case. Stay curious, stay honest, and never stop asking why.
And so the file closes. But the case doesn't. Not for the families. Not for the witnesses who still pause before answering questions. Not for a city that remembers, even when it pretends not to. The evidence sits somewhere in a box. The photographs fade. The names are spoken less often. But the echoes remain. If this story stayed with you, if you felt that silence at the end of each unanswered question, subscribe to the channel. Not for us. For the stories that never got a second look. For the voices that were cut short. For the cases that refuse to stay buried. Because the truth doesn't disappear. It waits.
And as long as the questions are still unanswered, the case isn't over. It's just waiting for someone to look again.
And here, it keeps reverberating.